Hello, everybody. My name's John, teaching politics here. This is an introductory lecture to the US president. But before we do this, I'm just going to cut away quickly to a video I made earlier where I talked to you all a little bit about politics. Catch up with you again in 5 minutes' time. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Politics on Petrol Pace. My name's John. I teach history here as well as A-level politics, and I'm also the manager for the social sciences area, so you may get to know me pretty well over the course of your study. So the idea today is to give you a little introduction to what A-level politics is for. There'll be a session attached to this video after I've given you the sort of overall view. Now, a lot of people would ask, what's the point of studying politics? It's just a bunch of people that cynically lie to get what they want. That's been in the news a lot lately. Or sometimes it's almost farcical, it's almost ridiculous. I mean, how do you end up with a situation where it's more about what people perceive than actually the truth? Well, those kinds of statements are the exact reason why it should be people like you studying A-level politics. The idea of this course is not to tell you to be a Tory or to be Labour or to be Liberal or to be whatever political party or persuasion you want. That's up for you to decide, just as it's up to everybody in our country. It's so that you're equipped and armed with the tools and critical, sceptical thinking that enables you to be able to see that those people aren't telling the truth. Because if you can do that, and more importantly, if you can communicate that to others, not because you think it's right, but because you can persuade other people that what you think is right or the way the world works could be improved, then if you can do that, you will hopefully be able to make tomorrow better than today. That's why you study it. Now, in terms of the actual course, there are broadly 3 key components, each examined in its own separate paper at the end of 2 years. There is no coursework. So, paper 1 is about the United Kingdom. It is a study of both the political structures of the UK, so that's things like how does Parliament work, and also the politics of the UK, so that's how does it function. So for example, why do referendum results go the way they do? Why do general elections go the way they do? The kind of stuff that you hear people talking a lot in and about a general election, but actually a lot of the time, I think the vast majority of people, including very well educated people, don't really understand this. They get a broad idea, but they don't know how it works. So we'll teach you how it works, and then therefore how a system can be changed or it can be improved. Paper 2 is what we call a comparative paper. So it comes from the political idea of comparative political science, which sort of was grown in the 50s, 60s and 70s. It's an idea that every political system fundamentally does the same things. It's just different structures and organisations do them. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Queen is our head of state. What does that mean? The Prime Minister is our head of government. What does that mean? In the United States, the President is both the head of state and the head of government. Plus, the President is directly elected, whereas the Prime Minister is indirectly elected. So, I'm technically actually appointed. So what we're looking at in this paper is the abstraction, these ideas in general, and then we look at how they work in different political systems. Now, of course, the main focus of this will be the United States and how it compares to the United Kingdom. But that doesn't mean that other countries won't get involved. For example, you could consider devolution and federalism in the context of Spain and Catalonia. Barcelona Football Club, if any of you know about that. That's been in the news, well, it was until before COVID, the independence movement in Catalonia. Now, the final component is possibly my favourite, actually. But the final component is the political ideas paper. So, you will hear people wandering around all the time on Twitter at the moment talking and saying things like, I don't like you because you're liberal. I don't like you because you're conservative. Well, I'm a communist and I don't like all of you. And varying different ideas. People talk about things like the alt-right and anarcho-feminism and all these kinds of isms. These isms that people chuck around all the time. But again, a lot of people use them without really understanding the historical context. Whether you are or are not a socialist, socialism is broadly 2 centuries old. It's developed, it's moved, it's adapted over this period of time. Where did the key thinkers come from? What are the ideas? So that third paper focuses on the political ideas behind four broad areas: liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and currently at this point, nationalism. Now that doesn't mean you won't study far, far more. It's just that's the focus and nature of the study. So paper 1, politics and constitution of the UK. Paper 2, United States compared to the United Kingdom. Paper 3, political ideas. Excellent. So I'm going to leave this part of the presentation now and get straight back into a lecture that we're talking about. I'm going to leave this presentation right now and get straight back into the lecture which I've set up for you this morning for you guys to prepare. I really, really look forward to seeing you all in September, and we can have some great discussions, and hopefully you will leave Petrock in 2 and a bit years time, about 2 years time, being considerably more informed on understanding the world in a better way than before. Catch you all later. Cool. Well, I hope you're all feeling inspired. The idea of what I'm going to try and do here today is give you an introduction to the genuine kind of content that you look at in your course. So this isn't going to be just sort of like, here's a little bit here, here's a few tasks. This is a session, I've adapted it slightly, that I genuinely did with our current first year learners. Remember that those guys are a year older than you. They're further along in their journey. There is language and technical terms that they understand that you do not. But I don't want you to be afraid of that. I'm not trying to hide you. I'm not trying to shield you like children. I'm trying to talk to you like young adults. You won't know what everything means. That's why you study it. It takes years, and not just doing an A-level in it. It takes experience of life to really get an understanding of many of the ideas talked about here. So don't worry too much if it all feels like it means nothing to you. A number of our students in the first and second year felt the same thing. That's why you study it. Okay, so the style of this, other than me talking kind of directly to the camera now, will be kind of like an online lesson. So I'll be working from my screen, which hopefully you guys should be able to see at this moment in time up in the top right-hand corner. I'm just going to click through to that to make sure that it's there. So I'm going to work through this Google Slides that is available to you, and you will have tasks and things that you can work on and deal with over the course of the next few weeks. Excellent. Right, let's get going. So I thought that a good introductory lecture on this topic could be the US presidency. It's perennially in the news at the moment, perennially, all the time. That's the idea, because the current occupant of the office is certainly a divisive figure who is not afraid of making his mind known. But we're not really talking about Donald Trump specifically here. We're more going to be talking about what the presidency actually is as an office. Now, what I mean by that is that in our world, the kind of liberal, democratic world in which we live in which the vast majority of the world either does live in or at least pertains to live in, we have the concept that your job is distinct from your person. You are both an individual and you are or have a job. That's why people ask that question. What do you do? What do you want to be? You are an individual choices, but you also have a role. Consider it in terms of a football club. So Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is a person, but Ole Gunnar Solskjaer currently has the office of manager of Manchester United, or insert whichever football team you like. Boris Johnson is a person, but he also has the office of Prime Minister. That's the idea. So Donald Trump is a person, but he is also the president. But he won't always be the president, and he wasn't always the president before. At some point, he will leave that office. He will always be Donald Trump. So that's the idea. We're going to look at the presidency and what the office is, what the job is, and why it exists the way it does. Now, in terms of kind of like learning tasks, I've kind of thought of this about dividing it into kind of like 4 separate sessions. So you could say it's maybe 4 sessions of an hour or something. So there's work in here that will keep you kind of focused for a longer period than just watching me. Consider this kind of like the index, the key to it. This is going to look at the office, and it's going to look at what the powers the president has, the limits to those powers, both written and unofficial, a little bit about the history of the presidency, because, I mean, what is politics without context? Some fascinating people have existed in that way. And also a final bit, which might be a little challenging for you guys at this point. So don't worry if you can't do it. But the idea is to compare the presidency to the UK, probably more specifically to the role of Prime Minister. Now, all study at A level is kind of focused on questions because that's what you have to do in your final exams. You have to analyze and evaluate. You are going to get very tired of hearing those words, but trust me, you will know fully what they mean by the end of your A levels, not just in politics, in virtually all of your subjects. Analyze and evaluate will be part of it. So, what I've done is I've set up the sort of question that a student, 18 years old, at the end of their course would be asked to answer. The UK PM has more power within the UK political system than the US president has within the US political system. Analyze and evaluate this statement. So I'm not going to ask you to write this essay. You're not currently studying, but that is where you will be by the end of 2 years. Like I say, don't worry if it seems confusing. This is an introduction, and it's perfectly normal for students to feel like they don't know anything. This is particularly true if you've got colleagues who talk all the time about politics and seem to know and understand things that you don't. You don't need to know a lot about politics. You need to know about people, and you all know about people. All the politics is adding the language, the terminology, the systems to it. So just because someone else talks a lot doesn't mean they're going to be better than you at A-level politics. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. In fact, if you don't know anything about it, maybe you're the best sort of person to do it. Okay, so let's do an overview. So the presidency. As I said in my intro video, the president is both the head of state and head of government. These are roles, these are functions. So this means the head of state is the person who embodies that state, that country. So in the United Kingdom, we have the Queen. That's why when there's anything done which is about meeting world leaders formally, when they have all the processions and the parades, it is the Queen that does it, because the Queen is the embodiment of the United Kingdom. She is us, she is the country as a person. France has Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France. He has that same role. He embodies the French Republic. He is a person who shows it. The Emperor of Japan has that role in Japan. He doesn't run the country, much like the Queen, but he is the person that embodies Japan, its history, its country, its values. And in the United States, they have the president. However, the president is also head of government. When we say the phrase head of government, we mean something very specific. Head of government is the chief executive for your country. So for us, that's Boris Johnson currently. Before Boris Johnson, it was Theresa May. Before Theresa May, it was David Cameron. Before David Cameron, it was Gordon Brown. Before Gordon Brown, it was Tony Blair. And I'm going back a bit further, but you get the idea. They're basically the person who's been given the power to run the government, to tell the civil service what they need to do, to react to coronavirus, those kinds of ideas. Now, the US is perhaps the most famous political office in the world. You often hear the phrase say, at this point, the most powerful man in the world. Could be the most powerful person or perhaps powerful woman, but it hasn't happened yet. It's an example of what we call in italics a strong presidency. That means a president with a lot of power. The French president is also a strong president. It means that the president has a lot of authority. Whereas you might take a country like Germany. How many of you could name me the president of Germany? Now, if you said Angela Merkel, you're wrong. Angela Merkel is the chancellor. She's their head of government. But Germany has a system where the president is a weak president. They have a president who sits and represents the republic, but doesn't really have much role in its running. Some of you doing history might understand why Germany would want to have a weak presidency. Now, with this bit, how they're elected, the president is not strictly directly elected, but effectively is. What we mean by direct election is we mean that when you vote for the person. So if you were an American or are an American, maybe some of you are, in November, well, you won't because you won't be 18, but in November, you vote for Donald Trump or you vote for Hillary Clinton or you vote for Joe Biden. You don't vote for the party, you vote for the person. In the UK, none of you, and probably few of your parents, directly voted for Boris. They voted for the local MP, which in North Devon is Celine. That's the idea there. And then those MPs chose your prime minister for you. That's why it's indirect. So those are some of the terms. I've got a few bits in italics throughout here. Again, I don't expect you to know everything about it, but please, if you're interested, you go and have a look at them to build your knowledge up. Now, when you look at the presidency, you've got to understand that the United States has something called the US Constitution. It is its fundamental law. Fundamental means basic, the bottom of. So the US Constitution is the ultimate authority, or the phrase we use in politics we call sovereign authority in the United States. It tells the US system what is and is not the law. Part of the Constitution is Article 2, and Article 2 deals with the presidency. Now, I've actually linked this for you here, so I'm just going to click through on it. The Constitution isn't actually very long. I know it might feel like it is, but that's it. A country that's existed for broadly 200, let's figure this out. Depends on when you date it from, but about 230, 240 years, 240 years, that kind of region there. A country has a document that is only, what's that? How many pages on that? 16, 17 pages long that talks about how it runs. Now, the bit that deals specifically with the presidency is Article 2. So these are the powers of the president. Now, I'm not going to leave you just with this document to leave. I've got video links and things for you to look at, to work through. But here is some good stuff that why not just go to the Constitution? See what you do understand, see what you don't. The things you don't understand, you will ask your teachers eventually, but you can also go look them up. Please also check out this video on how the Constitution embodies the separation of powers. I've actually linked it further down here, so I will amend that before I send this to all of you. Okay, so like I said, Session 1, powers of the presidency. Session 2, limits to presidential power. Session 3, history of the presidency. Section 4, comparing the presidency to the UK. So this is what I want you to do. So what we have here is constitutional and implied powers. Constitutional powers means powers explicitly given to the president. Implied powers means powers that, although they are not necessarily written down, it seems clear that the president has them. So if I just go back to the Constitution, let's find Article 2. Here you go. Section 2, Article 2. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. There you go, it's pretty clear. One of the powers of the presidents is they are in charge of the US military, as the phrase they like to use. In the UK, we tend to use the phrase armed forces. That's the idea. That's an implied power. He shall have power by and with advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. He deals with foreign policy. It is his job to interact with foreign countries. Notice the stuff about Ukraine recently and before COVID, in the potential impeachment of Donald Trump was connected to that. So these are the president's constitutional powers. Now, I've also linked videos here. These are the crash course ones. So perhaps they're a little low in level for you guys, or perhaps they're exactly about the right point. I get the impression they're kind of built for sort of like, what do they call them? High school freshman kind of level in the United States, which would be people about 15. So you could have a look at that. But go through these and have an idea. These will give you a place to start in terms of the power of the president. Now, what I've done is I've created empty slides, but I've given you a heads up. So commander-in-chief is some of the presidential powers. Foreign policy, that means how the United States interacts with foreign countries. Cabinet appointment, this means appointing the people in the United States who run the country. The federal bureaucracy is just the American name for the civil service. It is the name for literally I have no idea how many people it is, but in America, I'd imagine it might reach hundreds of thousands, but it is certainly the tens of thousands of people that actually just run the United States. things like everything from the national parks to the court. Actually, I don't know if the court system. Yeah, the Department for Justice, the court system. Presidential veto of legislation. Legislation is law passed by Congress, which is their body that writes laws, senators and congressmen. Executive orders. Donald Trump has just recently become very upset that Twitter and Jack Dorsey said that some of his facts may not be correct. So he passed an executive order to attack them. So what is this? Presidential pardon, forgiving people their crimes, nomination to the Supreme Court. That'd be an interesting one. You might have to spend a little longer looking at it. What I want you to do for this kind of first hour is go through these and start notating onto here. Doesn't matter if you don't understand everything. Doesn't matter if you don't get it straight away. Why would you get something you spend 2 years studying in 1 hour before you've started a course? But you never reach a point where you get it if you don't first start when you're ignorant of it. So that's your goal for that first hour. What are the powers of the president? Excellent. That's hour one. Okay, let's move on then. Second one. In reality, though, the most powerful person in the world still has limits to their power. You can get very philosophical about this. I mean, you can really be, how many films talk about this concept? I mean, I have to admit, I haven't seen the Avengers films, but I believe that the last one featured the kind of idea of somebody whose goal is to become all powerful, or something whose goal is to become all powerful. But in the end, there were limits to their power. It's a deep concept that exists in our civilization, the idea that no matter how powerful you can appear, there are always limits. I mean, the Harry Potter books dealt with exactly the same idea. Lord Voldemort wants to conquer death, but even he cannot conquer death. There are limits to his power. That's the idea. In terms of the president, there are limits to their power. Donald Trump, for example, is very unhappy with Twitter. But how much can he actually do to Twitter within the limits of the Constitution, the law, and the American system? Just because you want to attack another country doesn't mean you can. Just because you want to use an office to make yourself richer doesn't mean you can. All of those answers seemed very cynical. So let's also try some positive things. Just because you want to make America a better place doesn't mean you can. There are limits to what you can do. Barack Obama found this out. Now, whether you approve of it or not, but Obama had his policy to try and make what they called Obamacare, which was to expand American healthcare so that everyone was covered, a little like the NHS. But Obama wasn't able to do that. He was able to get something, but not what he wanted. So again, same thing here. I've put headings, and there's a few bits written on here to give you a starting place. But the Constitution limits the power of the America. The law limit of the president. The law limits their power. Congressional oversight. Again, sounds like a technical term, but all that means is that America's, what they call Congress, and we'd probably call Parliament, they have the ability to scrutinize the president's behavior, to pass laws. So they watch what he does on behalf of the people. And if they don't like it, they criticize him. For example, the impeachment process that happened earlier this year, though it feels like a lifetime ago right now. Limited legislative powers. Again, the president has a lot of power, but he doesn't really have the power to pass laws. Look that up, see what that means. Money and finance. Yes, the president commands the army, but the president doesn't pay the army. And armies don't do things when they're not paid to do it. Congress pays them. So there are limits to his power. He can tell people what to do, but he can't get the money to do it. That has to come from somewhere else. Limits of time. You can only be president for 2 terms. That means, on the whole, 8 years. That's a limit. You can't be president for longer than that. And that's written in the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. Again, why does that exist? What does it mean? And also the idea America is a federal country. That means it's a country made up of 50 countries. The UK is not. The UK is a single country, though it does have devolved areas. They call it like Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and London, in fact. But the United States is 50 states joined together as one. So these are all limits to the power of the president. Particular place you could have a good look for arguments here is the arguments that Donald Trump has been having with Andrew Cuomo, who is the current is it governor of New York or mayor of New York City? I think it's governor of New York State. The president has limits to how much he can tell New York to do what they want to do. Apologies, just need to cough. Don't worry, I'm perfectly healthy. So that would be your second hour. Limits to presidential power. So in the first, you're going to look at what their powers are. Second, you're going to see what are their limits. Now, the third part then, there is you can find examples of this. I haven't needed to link things here. It's more just building kind of what we call your knowledge, or a good phrase, how well read you are, your erudition about US presidents. In your exams, in A-level politics, you can talk in general, such as I've done, and say the president has this power, the president has this power. But you will also be expected to give examples of this in practice. I've talked a fair amount about Donald Trump. I did mention Obama a little bit. So I mentioned Obama and Trump as both examples of limits to power. For example, Obama was not able to pass Obamacare the way he wanted. For example, Donald Trump was not able to ban Muslim immigrants from coming to the United States back in 2016, if you remember. The limits of their power with examples. So I've picked out some significant ones, and the idea for you to be here will be to go through and write some points down about these presidents. What you should not do here is copy and paste large blocks of text from Wikipedia or any other source. This is not an assessed task. Your goal here is not to show me, your teacher, that you've done lots of work. Your goal here is actually to learn about it. If you just go to Wikipedia and copy and paste into this box, then you haven't done any processing. It's better that you write less and understand it more than you copy and paste lots of text and then in your mind shelve it for later. So perhaps the most famous of all, or at least the first, George Washington, general of the Continental Army during the War of Independence and the first president of the United States. An interesting figure, Virginian chap, definitely a patrician. That means he was part of the kind of ruling class of the United States and a slave owner as well from Virginia. Another very famous one, Thomas Jefferson, another of the founding fathers. He is famous because he is the guy that drafted the Declaration of Independence and had a hefty role in the creation of the Constitution. So in some ways, Washington is the guy that won the United States. Thomas Jefferson is the guy that wrote what it would be. That's a horrendous oversimplification, but it's not a bad place to start. He's very good with phrases, this guy. Have a look at some of his phrases. Andrew Jackson. This guy is actually a hero of Donald Trump, but Andrew Jackson was also a general 30 or 40 years later who made his name defeating the British, perhaps America's first populist president. That's what we mean when we say a president that is loved by the people but hated by the establishment. He's also seen as the founder of the Democratic Party of the United States, which is why I put a little donkey up here. This is the symbol of the Democratic Party, a donkey. It's a jackass after its founder, Andrew Jackson, because he was called a jackass. Again, this guy's an interesting guy. He fought duels a lot. You know, the old days where posh gentlemen would line up at dawn and then turn around and shoot each other with pistols. And, you know, he got shot quite a few times and killed quite a few people in his duels. He's certainly a hard-living character. Lincoln. By the way, the elephant is the symbol of the Republican Party. The first Republican president of the United States, perhaps even more than Washington, the most famous president in American history. The president who, depending on your interpretation or not, but led the United States through a civil war where his side, the North, defeated the South over slavery. So the president that ended slavery or presided over the end of slavery. Ulysses S. Grant, great name. General during the Civil War, who became a president. Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. Interesting, again, this guy is one of those larger-than-life figures. Did so many interesting things as president, but also his life. I mean, he got shot when he was out And then he got back up and then made his speech while he was bleeding out of his side at the beginning of the 20th century. He is a strong character. He's also the guy which teddy bears are named after, because he used to like, this is where he's less likable to many, but he used to like hunting a lot. And the teddy bears are named after Teddy Roosevelt. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the longest serving president of the United States. He had 4 terms in office before the 22nd Amendment. I've put a few points down here. But he's most famous as the president that presided over both. Well, the simple version of history is he is the president that took America out of the Great Depression, or through the Great Depression of the 1930s with his New Deal. And he is also the president that took America to the verge of victory in the Second World War. However, Roosevelt also died before the end of the Second World War. So sometimes he even gets compared to Moses in some ways. He led the people to victory, but he could never get there himself. He is a powerful figure in American politics. So what I'd do is look these guys up and have a look at a few notes on them. There's so many documentaries on them. There's so many short YouTube videos, long ones, some pitched at high levels, some at low levels. Get an idea of who each of them are and how they connect to the fabric of the office of the presidency. Building on that, it's not a history course, A-level politics. So it's not like you'll get a question like, what did Abraham Lincoln do? They are examples for you. But in reality, I think really it's from Roosevelt on, you want to develop more of a knowledge of presidents. There you go. That's what I've just said here. So for example, I've done Harry Truman here, who was Roosevelt's vice president, who became president when Roosevelt died. And you get Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, or Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, of course, was the president who resigned in scandal. Gerald Ford, he's the one from the middle of the 70s no one remembers. Jimmy Carter, again, Democratic president. Ronald Reagan, much more famous film, B-list film, B-grade film actor who became a president. George H. Bush, who died last year, president during the first Gulf War. Bill Clinton, husband of Hillary. George W. Bush, who would have been president when you guys were born, who is perhaps most famous for his reaction to 9/11 and the Iraq War. Barack Obama, who I'm assuming you guys remember. And of course, Donald Trump. What I would do again is a few points about them and how they've been presidents. Okay. So I don't know exactly how that will look. I mean, that's a task that will take you as long as you choose to spend on it. But, maybe an hour is a good place to start. But if you really enjoy it or want to know more, please have a look at more. Like these presidents as well, they've got lots of Netflix documentaries on them and so on, so you can build your knowledge there. Okay. So your final task is comparing the presidency to the UK. Now, this task is going to take you a little longer. I also don't think that you necessarily at this point will be able to do it particularly well, because you don't necessarily understand a lot of these constitutional structures and functions, how they work, and also how the UK one works. So what I'm asking you to do is not expect to know the answer, is actually to start exploring the question. Now, I'll give you an example. The president is directly elected. The prime minister is selected by parliament. What does that mean? Investigate it. Be inquisitive. Executive function versus legislative function. So again, these are technical terms, but executive means your power to tell people what to do, like a chief executive. Legislative means your power to write law. And the UK PM has much, much more authority when it comes to law writing than the US president. Again, executive and legislative. And a constituted role versus a role that's growing in significance. So the US presidency was created when the Constitution was created in the 1780s. But the prime minister was never a role that existed. It's grown. It's become a role that we understand, particularly over the last 2 to 2.5 centuries. So you've kind of got this difference between what they do. Now, the idea here will be for you not to say one is better than the other, or to say Trump is better than Johnson, or Blair is better than Obama, or whatever. It's not about the people. It's more about the job. What is different between the two jobs? By the end of it, maybe, just maybe, you might be able to start thinking about this question. I'm not going to ask you to write this essay. It's far too early. But obviously, within the UK, is the Prime Minister more powerful than the President is within the United States? You can answer either way. There isn't a right answer here. There are just good ones. Does the UK Prime Minister have more influence inside the UK than the US President has within theirs? And you can lean either way. That's the idea. Cool. Right, so that's the introduction to this. So just bring it back to what you do. You can speak to through the Pet Shop Pace website, contact the administrators and so on if you'd like me to have a look at things. I may be doing more on this at a later point this term. I have to say again, don't feel intimidated, feel excited. All that stuff you don't know is stuff that you can learn. And if you do politics, or when you do politics next year, think about this. In November, there's a presidential election. You have a presidential election coming up right slap bang at the perfect time in your course for it to matter to you. Long enough that you can absorb it and use those examples in your exams, because you will talk about it in your exams. I mean, COVID has been terrible, but it's also presented loads of new points for discussion. The previous students only had Brexit to talk about all the way up to the end of their exams. Now you guys have got coronavirus and the response to that in the world. There are things happening in the world which this subject will help you do. So it will be an exciting time to study it, or a challenging one, but also it will give it meaning beyond anything else. Excellent. Thank you for bearing with me, guys. And if I don't speak to you again, I will see you all in September, and I look forward to it. Thanks, guys.